And joining us now in studio, John Ralston Saul, author of The Collapse of Globalism and the Reinvention of the World. He's also president of International Pen. Hello again.
Hi.
Okay, we're in 2012. We're going to go back to 2008. Who's to blame? Should we be blaming the bankers for the financial collapse?
No, I mean, I don't think I think it's too late to blame anybody. There's too many people involved.
Okay, who should we hold responsible?
Well, the first people to hold responsible are the people you elect. The second people to hold responsible are the civil servants who give advice to the people you elect. The third group would be the departments of economics. In general, there are exceptions to the rule, who engaged in a kind of intellectual cleansing process through the globalist period, where they got rid of, take the University of Toronto, they really got rid of the economic historians, people who have memory, people who actually know what happens when you do this or that. And they really bought into the theory, more or less bought into the theory. So that even today, say, with all of the things that are happening, they're still teaching the same theory. They haven't learned a thing, most of them, from the reality of the world. Say, why? These people aren't listening to us. This is the way the theory is supposed to work. So, that would be three groups one could hold responsible. The people who write columns and things like that, those are the crumbs off the table, right? I think that it's probably not useful to hold the business community responsible, in the sense that if you open the door and allow capitalism or speculation to do what it wants, it will. You can't ask, it is not by its own definition, a self-limiting business. It's not moral or immoral, it's an amoral activity in and of itself. It is necessary, but doesn't give direction. So it's up to citizens through their organizations, like education, government administration, to shape all of this. And of course, it's up to writers to talk about it and think about it, and journalists and so on, and to make sure there are conversations around tables and houses. And people have to have the language to feel that they have the right to say, I don't think globalism's working, but that doesn't mean that I'm an old-fashioned nationalist. It means I don't think globalism is working, and there must be another theory we can use.
You say, though, I think when most people look back at 2008, we refer to it as the financial collapse, the financial crisis. You argue that this is about something much bigger, that it's just a symptom.
Yeah, well, it's a financial collapse in the same sense that '73 was an oil crisis.
Which you say it wasn't an oil crisis.
Well, it was. Of course, on the surface, it was. There was an oil crisis. But it was a symptom of the larger problems of the day. And if you actually look, for example, at the quantity of money, I'm going to supply-side economics, the quantity of money available. And I can't remember the numbers, I'm terrible at that, but you just see it multiplying and multiplying, and you can do it on the basis of how much sort of money there is of all sorts, right, compared to goods being traded and sold. So, the necessary illusion that money is real, which it isn't. It's a convention that we agree that it's real.
Like time.
Yeah, like time. Well, time is unfortunately realer than money. And you can just see it from the 70s on multiplying. I forgot what the numbers are. At one date, there's 25 times more money than goods, and then it's 50, and then it's. So in fact, there's never been so much cash. Junk bonds, credit cards. There's just never been so much cash as a ratio to reality, to real goods, to real lives. So the idea that that we're short of money is actually an illusion. What's actually happening is, and this is the bigger question, which is that the Western world idea of capitalism, which is related to its idea of socialism and everything, liberalism, which is that, for 200 years, we believed that we had to have competition. And competition has various elements in it, and, levels of taxes and levels of tariffs and all these things. But the thing that's always forgotten is that the reason that capitalism worked from 17 whatever's on was that there weren't enough goods. There was a shortage of goods. And it's the shortage of goods that makes competition work. There aren't enough houses. So you can actually have a competition over the value of a house, right? Normally, Toronto accepted, when there are too many houses, there's a surplus and the price collapses, right? So basically, when you look at the West in the 1970s, more or less at that point, we have solved the conundrum of scarcity in the West. We have enough goods. We can produce enough goods. We can produce enough food. We have problems distributing it fairly, but we're now in surplus.
Perpetual surpluses.
Perpetual surplus. So once we're in perpetual surplus because of technology, whatever, a big success story, for capitalism, for technology. Once you're in surplus, you have to rethink your theory completely. Instead of rethinking our theory, we went into this sort of globalist escapism where we thought, well, if we just take away the borders and say we'll grow trade, and that'll get us out of the problem, and we'll sell more goods into the developing world. And then, China and India will come in, and this will create a whole new, and this will change it. But we won't have to change our basic theory. But the trouble is that actually China was only selling, not consuming, and if they're going to consume, they're going to consume their own goods, not our goods. So it doesn't solve the growth problem. It doesn't solve the competition problem. So what they did was they started moving towards service industries. They started moving towards playing with money. So you just more and more money, flipping, imagination, more and more people making money out of money. But of course, sensible people, Adam Smith would look at that and say, are you crazy? You're on the road to disaster. You don't need that much money. There is no serious economist in history who would say that the sensible way to deal with your economy is to create this enormous souffle based on no reality. So eventually it would collapse.
And the bank said, we need more money, and the government said, okay, here's more money. They bailed them out. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think basically what, this is an enormous issue. There are many parts to it, and I'm oversimplifying. But for example, instead of in the United States bailing out the banks, you could have taken less money and simply written off all the mortgages. So in other words, instead of giving money to the people who own the mortgages, who own the rights over the people who hold the mortgages, you give the money to the people living in the houses. So now what you've actually done is, so you say you're a lower middle class family and you've got an income of whatever that is in the United States. I don't know what the technical figure is, but they have this big debt. You remove the debt of that family. Now they're free to indebt themselves. They're free to spend. So you could have actually relaunched a good part of the economy by, in fact, removing the obligations of the people in those houses. And it's just one tiny thing. There are many, they chose to give the money to the wrong people because they believed the important thing was to keep lending going. Whereas in fact, there are many ways of doing it. There are many ways of shifting money to people who will actually spend it. Like poorer people, middle class people. They'd actually spend the money. Whereas they gave it to these banks who did not spend it because they were on another game, playing another game, which had nothing to do with the well-being of the society or with growth. They're not interested in the growth of the society. They're interested in something very personal that has to do with their bank. So it's not their fault. It's the fault of the people who listened to the same advisors who caused the crisis. That's the sign of, other people have said this often, the sign of a society in trouble is when it has a major crisis and it turns to be saved to the people who caused the crisis. I mean, it's sort of like the First World War. You have really, really bad generals. They lose battle after battle, and you don't hang them. You don't fire them. You don't get rid of them. You just say, can you think of another battle you could fight?
Within the broader context, you're very careful to point out the difference between growth and real wealth creation. Why is that delineation so important?
Well, first of all, there's a game that's played about what is growth, and I gave yesterday this example of Ethiopia. I mean, is there real growth? or is it growth that looks good on paper? You know, people say, well, the number of people living on $2 a day has fallen, but then have you actually examined what it now means, what those numbers mean, what is the actual reality? Maybe what it means is, maybe, I'm not saying it does, maybe it means that they were living in a village where they could produce enough food locally to survive, but under this new model, they moved into a slum outside Lagos. And you couldn't count them when they were in the village, so they were making zero. Now they're living in a slum, suffering from, you know, very bad water, disease, suffering, and all. They are really poor now, but they're getting a wage. So suddenly they appear in the statistics. So I mean, this is the kind of thing one has to be very careful about. I remember I was at Johns Hopkins some years ago, before maybe 2006, which is one of the big centers of globalism, and you know, I did my spiel, and it was more controversial then than it is now. And the guy chairing it was the head of the economics department, who was clearly very unhappy. And at the end, and I talked about how Latin America had suffered, had been martyred. It was a martyrdom, and how they turned their back on the globalist methodology and were doing something else. And I just got the Pablo Neruda medal, you know, who's the greatest Latin American poet of the 20th century, probably, and all that stuff. And he, when he introduced me, said, I said to him, because I knew this was a big Latin American school, I said, you know, don't throw all that stuff away, but just mention I just got the Pablo Neruda medal, because I'm kind of proud of that. And when he did it, by the way he said the name, you could tell he didn't know who Pablo Neruda was, right? So when we finished, he said to me, you know, I didn't want to interfere, but I really disagreed with what you said about Latin American. I was part of the IMF team that we put together the whole structure for financing in Latin America in the 90s and so on. And you suddenly realize that these people who were thinking about economic theory had no idea where Latin America was. I mean, you know, if you don't know who Pablo Neruda is, and you're designing theories that are going to shape the lives of Latin America, there's a big problem. I think I give an example in one of my books of being on a plane flying business class to Singapore to go somewhere else, and there's a young guy sitting next to me in a very well-cut suit. And so we talked for a minute, and he's working for the World Bank, and I said, oh, and what are you doing? He said, well, I'm going to do, I think it's, you know, the annual report on Indonesia. I said, oh, you're an expert on Indonesia? He said, no, I've never been there before. I said, oh, so you've read a lot about Indonesia? He said, no. And I said, well, you're prepared yourself. He says, I have a briefing book. So it was that kind of, you know, Canada is the same as Ethiopia, is the same as Indonesia, is the same as the United States. We have a model. This is the model. It's the globalist model. It will work. Everywhere is different. You have to do something different in each place. That's the reality.
Is there, though, a primary beneficiary of economic growth? Is it the managers? Who is it?
Well, I mean, if you're in a period when there is the possibility of real growth, Canada benefited for a long time from real growth, then it can, if the policies are in place, governmental policies are in place, then the money can be spread around. There'll be jobs, there'll be schooling, there'll be healthcare, it'll be spread around, right? The difficulty comes when you're not really getting much real growth, and you're scrambling to make it sound like growth, which is what's happening now, so that you have some, you know, people like Krugman, who's a big critic of what's happening, saying we're in a depression, and then you have the official numbers saying Europe is just escaping a recession. You're saying, escaping a recession? There's over 20% unemployment in Spain. And they say, but it's not really that, because, you know, about 5% of those people are working in the black market, but they're working in the black market and they're working for low wages. You know, there's no crisis. There's no crisis in Europe, according to the statistics. So who are the beneficiaries of growth, if there's real growth and it's spread around properly? Everybody. If there isn't real growth, I guess what we're looking at now is, I don't know, who are the beneficiaries? You'd say right now it's the financial community. Certainly, the people who showed some of the least flexibility in all of this is the kind of managerial community, which has become so large. You know, I've written endlessly about this. We have public managers, but we also have private managers. See, globalism promised there'd be more competition. And instead of that, what we got was, in many, many sectors, a return of monopolies or oligopolies. You know, 2 or 3 gigantic corporations which control the market in this area. And they control it from end to end. So it's like it's not capitalism at all. It's really a return to the pre-capitalist period, mercantilist period, where there's very little competition. You know, Hudson's Bay Company, British East India Company, big horizontal structures that go from raw materials to consumption and control the market, and therefore can disguise the fact that really there isn't much growth and there isn't much competition. So those big structures, certainly the people managing it benefit. They call themselves capitalists, but they're really managers in drag, you know.
Managers in drag.
Yeah,
Okay.
pretending to be capitalists. They're really managing these great big bureaucracies. And, you know, doing wonderful packages for themselves and, you know, replacing real growth, real new products, new thinking with takeovers and restructuring, endless restructurings. You see, that's in place of doing something. And in the process, you indebt the company in a way which no government would be conscionably doing unless there was a major crisis. You indebt the company in order to pay for it as you buy it. So you cripple the company, but out of all of that, you, the manager, the group at the top, make an enormous amount of money, and then you go away and ruin another company or retire and play golf, or I don't know.
I guess the question, though, then is, how has our technological capacity for production really changed the debate that's going on whether we should maximize trade?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, trade is great. You know,
yeah, you
trade
talked
is
about
great.
the perpetual surplus.
You know, so trade is great, but the idea that we can save ourselves through an increasing amount of trade is wrong, and that not believing in an ever perpetually increasing amount of trade means you're against trade and you're a protectionist. That's not true either. Trade is very important, but it is not getting us out of the crisis. Look, I mean, we're 40 years of believing absolutely in the importance of increasing trade. Look at the crisis we're in. Look at the absence of growth. You know, everybody's stymied. So it's not working. The continual growth in trade is not working. It doesn't mean we should close borders. It doesn't mean we should stop trading. But it means we have to think seriously about what could we do that will work. I mean, for example, because we've used this very mechanistic idea of what is cost and what is profit, it's become very difficult to say, well, you know, we could, as they did 200 years ago or 100 years ago, we could define other things as investment rather than cost. You know, we struggled, for example, with the whole environmental movement, which is clearly an enormous, big crisis that's happening, but we've struggled with how to deal with it because we're still stuck with this idea, but there's so many costs attached to it. The reason it appears to be costs is the way they do the math. You know, the way they've separated everything out so that the polluting of a river is separated from the occupation of the factory, which is separated from the healthcare implications. It's all separated out. If you put all that together, you suddenly say, well, you know, if we actually invested in the environment, it's not a cost, it's an investment. It actually produces wealth. Here's an area where there isn't surplus. Here's an area where there is scarcity. The whole environmental area, where if we treat it as investment instead of cost, wealth will be created, and we will do very well out of it, and we will be better off, both as an economic unit, but also as a society. Our health will be better. It will actually cost less to public health because we've invested in this area, for example.
You know, you've mentioned a few times that this idea we need to rethink where we are and where we're going. are we, I guess capable is the wrong word, but I mean, is there this sort of desire to actually rethink, or are we sort of stuck in a trap?
Well, I mean, first of all, we're perfectly capable of it because we've done it endlessly. Secondly, we've never had so many educated people. We've never had such a big, middle class, upper middle class, people who spent years in universities. So theoretically, we ought to be better able than ever before. I guess the problem partly is that people with power are third, fourth, fifth generation of people in the globalist era. And they don't have any other tools at hand. So, somebody as smart and I think interesting as President Obama comes to power, economics is not his big area. And so he looks around for advice and finds that the only advice he can get is the same advice that everybody's been giving. He can't find anybody easily who'll give him different advice. So there has to be that sense that that there's admiration for disagreement, that there's admiration for new ideas, that there has been a failure, and therefore we have to bring new ideas onto the carpet. So by refusing that very simple proposition, what you're getting is a rise of populism. Populism is always a sign of anger in the citizenry, anger with the people in charge. And at a certain point, when the people in charge are not delivering, it takes the form of populism. You're getting a return of racism. You're getting a return of ugly nationalism. This is not being caused by the anti-globalist movement. This is being caused by the failure of globalism. So I'll give you a very simple example. So Greece is a place that, admittedly was cheating in all sorts of ways and, was not acting properly, in terms of taxes, in terms of work and so on. And it got an unacceptable level of debt. How do you deal with that? So the established approach has been that to punish them, to write off as little of the debt as possible and maintain as much of the debt as possible in order to make them suffer, to learn their lesson. It's like being at, a church meeting, you have sinned, you will suffer. And at the same time, not really offering them anything that would say, well, if I did pay my taxes and I did go to school and I did do this, how will I feed my children? What about my grandmother? How are we going to live here? How is this society going to work? So that what they came up with was a package, which was a punishment package, which offered nothing. Now, what they could have done, and I'm just giving this as a single example, a sensible thing to have done would have been to say, this debt isn't worth anything. And history tells us that when debt gets to the unpayable, unmaintainable point, you just rip it up. You get rid of it. And so they got rid of half of it. Why did they get rid of half of it? If they got rid of 80% of it and put in some very strict rules about how Greece should be run, it would be a happy-ish place on the road to somewhere. Instead of that, they missed this opportunity, and the result who knows what the result will be. Probably going to do the same thing in Spain. It's causing governments to fall all over the place. It's causing neo-fascist, fascist parties, extreme left-wing parties to reappear because of the failure of those who are in positions of power to just say, look, these are real human beings. They live in real places. It doesn't matter whether you're on the left or the right. How do we do this? And I'm sorry I'm going on a bit, but the history of unmanageable debt is clear. In smart civilizations, you make it go away. In degenerate or dumb civilizations, you pretend that it's a moral problem and that everybody must suffer until it's paid. So you do things like austerity, which is, I think I've said, has never produced prosperity. And you try to prop up this souffle, which cannot be propped up. In the 90s, in Voltaire's Bastards, there's a chapter in there about the West's approach towards the African debt. For, 10, 15 years, we martyrized them. I'm using the word again. We martyrized Africa. Morally, you will pay this debt. Well, you can't pay that. Well, you will pay that. And it went on and on and on. It was a disaster. People died. There was suffering. There were coups d'etats. There were civil wars. And eventually, and I can't even remember the date now, they ripped up a good part of the debt. But by the time they'd ripped it up, it was too late. They'd done the damage.
When you wrote your book, you predicted or saw the writing on the wall of what was going to happen. So standing here today, you said, we're maybe on the cusp of choosing to be a dumb civilization or a smart civilization. What are you predicting now?
I'm not. Because, my prediction was, it's over, we're in a vacuum. If you don't act soon, something will happen to us, then we will lose our freedom to act. That's what's happened. Now we're in a much tougher position. And all these forces are coming at us, as I say, populism, racism, it's nationalism of the worst sort. There could be protectionist movements. I mean, all sorts of things are happening. I think there has to be a kind of intellectual moment of truth where we admit failure, actually admit failure, and say we're looking for new ways of dealing with these problems. And then we will find some interesting answers. I mean, I give you a whole list of things we could be doing. I mean, how to rethink the beef industry in Alberta, how to think about how do we deal with water, how to think about the environment, how to think about a more interesting way of, if you're in a surplus of mass-produced goods, then what that means is you have a distribution problem. But what it actually means is you need fewer mass-produced goods and you need more value-added goods. So how do that's a change in direction. You move towards value-added. And people say, well, they'll be too expensive for people. Well, no. When you produce value-added goods, you pay better wages to the people who produce them. So you actually start moving back towards the idea of a middle-class society. You don't need mass production. You need slightly higher quality production. And that produces real wealth, and that produces a new kind of growth. I mean, there are all sorts of things that can be done, but it requires the kind of willpower that we had in the 1780s, that we had in the 1820s, that we had in the 1890s, that we had in the late 1930s, that we had in the 1950s, that willpower to say, okay, time to do something different. And that different is not propping up, enormous falling soufflés of debt.
We await to see if that moment will arrive. John Ralston Saul, thank you. Always fascinating talking to you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.